I only know how long I sat in that chair because of the time display constantly hovering in my peripheral vision. As the hours trudged past in the ever-present daylight of our orbit, what was there to do other than sit back and contemplate the hopeless facts? Did it really matter why the other crew weren't filling the rest of the seats around me? Did it really matter whether or not the landers ever left the docking bay? There was no mission anymore. By then, the surface of the Earth would have been more than half consumed by thunderstorms and lakes of boiling lava. Either humanity had found another home among the stars without us, or they had vanished into the fire and poisoned atmosphere with the rest of the planet. Earthside HQ no longer existed. Our superior officers would have died over a century ago, and they would have given us up for dead long before then. We were floating in the cold vacuum of space alone, light years from home, and likely the last of our kind. Our kind, I thought. I may have been using that term prematurely. I panned over to the Deck 3 cryochamber status, and it was worse than I thought. Of the 90 crew aboard, 73% had flatlined, 10% showed signs of brain hemorrhaging, and the rest showed vital readouts offline. It was nothing short of a miracle that I woke up at all, let alone healthy. Even so, I don't know if I would have considered myself fortunate. It was a useless gesture, but I decided to check for survivors. Really, given the circumstances, any gesture short of acceptance and death would have been useless. Still, if I had to resign myself to my grim fate, I might as well go out with some company. It may have been cruel to wake them and make them aware of the situation, but the thought of being the last man alive left me with a sour feeling in my stomach. I couldn't give up the chance to speak to another human being at least once more in my life. I wound up relying on a flashlight a few yards into the Deck 3 descent, and only the dimming emergency fluorescent tubes lit the first few. At some point, the energy had failed in that sector, and switched to the backup generators. Depending on how long ago the system had redirected power, and if the lights were any reliable indication, it would have been no wonder that cryostage malfunctioned. I can't imagine the pain through which they must have gone. The thought made me shudder. I turned the flashlight on each cryopod I passed by, and a few looked like they had died peacefully. But only a few. Most were frozen faces of suffering, some with tears turned to ice streaking down their faces. Some of their harnesses had released, leaving their corpses leaning their bruised foreheads against the glass shields, necks broken and twisted against their own body weight. I tripped over one whose shield had released and depressurized before cleaning his system of the blood insulation solution. His corpse lay rotting in a half-curled heap where he had tumbled forward, eyes open and mouth agape. There are no decomposer organisms in space. Prelon sterilization made sure of that. So, bodies don't rot the way they do on Earth. Instead, he looked dried up and brittle, mummified, as if the slightest nudge would cause him to collapse into dust. With my attention fixated on the tragedy before me, I almost didn't hear it. A faint call, just a few yards down the walkway, barely above a whisper. My heart leapt, and I rushed to the sound as fast as my legs would carry me. Sadly though, My hopes were dashed as I looked at his face. Frostbitten beyond treatment. With chattering teeth, and in an airy whisper, he pleaded, "Cold. So cold. Please. Please." His name was James Henrik, a young cadet fresh from the Hirschman Aerospace Training Facility in Nuremberg, Germany. And this was his first mission out of Earth's orbit. He was ambitious for one so young, just barely in his 20s. But it was the real go-getters that went far and moved up in the chain of command. He was respectful too, always addressing his elders as sir or ma'am, regardless of rank. We had spoken at length many times before and after launch, and he was an eager and attentive listener. I liked him right from the start. Poor kid. He had no idea he was already dead. I could tell by the look in his eyes, long before I discovered him. Likely sometime within the prior 24 hours. His pod had sprung a coolant leak. It had already partially iced over the pods to his left and right. And it was probably dangerous to even stand as close as I did. The blood neutralizer had frozen solid in the leak, leaving him full of the insulation fluid. If I had released the chamber seal, the shock of the temperature and pressure changes would have paralyzed him. And without going through the neutralization process, he wouldn't have lived more than a single painful hour. The cardiovascular neuroregulator system had been keeping his heart beating, but it wouldn't help much longer. In truth, it had only prolonged his suffering. I would have liked nothing more than to repair the neutralizer system, but I had no training or authorization, and I'd have likely ended up killing him in the process anyway. Besides, the tissue damage from the frostbite was too deep and too severe. All I could do for him was put him out of his misery. He was such a good kid. He had such a bright future. When I looked at his face, I saw my son. Saw him in the way he might have looked on the day I should have returned. Saw the sorrow on his face when he realized Daddy would never be coming home. It was all I could think about as I tearfully and hesitantly tapped in the command to stop the neuroregulator. It's okay, kid. Just sleep now. It'll be over soon, I told him, longingly placing my hand against the freezing glass. I spent his final moments with him. As his heart slowed to a stop, and he closed his eyes for the last time, I never looked away. It was then that the gravity of my situation hit me. I truly was alone.